Hello and welcome to Factually. I'm Adam Conover. Thank you so much for joining me once again as I talk to an incredible person about all the amazing shit that they know that I don't know and that you might not know. Both of our minds are likely going to get blown together if you stick through this interview, so I hope you do. Now, before we get going, I want to remind everybody this is another YouTube episode of the show. So if you're listening on your favorite podcast player, go check it out on YouTube if you want to see the video. If you're watching on YouTube, subscribe in your favorite podcast player. Search for Factually every single week. We got another amazing interview for you, and we'd love to see you there. Also, if you want to support the show, please hit me up on Patreon, patreon.com/Adam Conover. Just $5 gets you every episode ad-free. You can join our community Discord, our community book club. We'd love to see you there, patreon.com/Adam Conover. Now, we have talked on this show before about mass incarceration. The U.S. has the largest prison population on Earth and the largest rate of incarceration for our citizens. We incarcerate more of our fellow Americans than any other nation does. And this is one of the great stains on this country. Mass incarceration destroys lives, it destroys families, it destroys entire communities, especially black and brown ones. And as we talked about on my Netflix show, The G Word, district attorneys are the most important way that we can make a dent in mass incarceration. Wherever you live, your local district attorney is the person who decides who gets charged for what crimes. They can decide whether someone who's caught with a little bit of drugs in their pocket, whether they go to prison or if they go to a drug diversion and rehab program. And also, around 95% of criminal cases in America never even go to trial. They're decided by plea bargains. And D.A.s are the ones who set the terms of those plea bargains. So they are, in a very real way, the judge, jury, and executioner of our criminal justice system. They're the ones who have the most control over how many people get locked up and for how long. And let me tell you something. Over the last couple decades, our district attorneys have not used their power for good. Instead, they have pursued tough on-crime policies that are designed not to figure out who did which crime and charge them appropriately, but to charge as many people as possible with as much prison time as possible. The consequences be damned. And the consequences of that have been disastrous for our country and our society. So if we want to end or even just make a dent in mass incarceration, the most important thing that we can do is elect reform-minded prosecutors who share those values. And the good news is we've actually been doing that across the country. In the last few years, we have seen reformist prosecutors elected in cities like Philadelphia, Chicago, Austin, San Francisco, and Los Angeles, where I live. And those prosecutors have started putting into place much-needed reforms, but not without controversy. You know, I think most people agree that we shouldn't be throwing people in prison for doing sex work or for having a little bit of drugs in their pocket, but not everybody feels that way. Some people really loved the status quo, and the backlash has been furious. Even though violent crime is at historic lows right now, there was a small uptick in crime during the pandemic, and reformist district attorneys were blamed for that uptick, even though there is no evidence that their policies had anything to do with it. There was a high-profile attempt to kick out Larry Krasner, the DA of Philadelphia. That attempt failed, but the district attorney of San Francisco, a man named Chesa Boudin, was successfully recalled. And here in Los Angeles, where I live, there was a high-profile recall attempt against George Gascon, which also failed, but it goes to show you how deep this backlash is. It's just a fact about human society and humanity in general that we have a huge status quo bias. Even though the status quo in criminal justice is terrible, it's one that generations in the future will ask, how the hell could we run the country this way? But despite that, there are still legions of people ready to fight back against any change. And that makes change very, very difficult. So what is it like being one of those DAs? Being at the top of an institution trying to make change in the face of sometimes overwhelming opposition? Well, today on the show, we have an incredible guest to answer that question. My guest today is Los Angeles District Attorney George Gascon. D.A. Gascon heads the largest prosecutorial office in the country, and his experience in office over the last 2 years reveals so much about why it is so difficult to make change in such an enormous system, but also what can happen if we really do try. So without further ado, let's get to the interview. Please welcome LA District Attorney George Gascon. George, thank you so much for being on the show.
It's my pleasure, Adam. Thank you for having me here.
So we've talked extensively on this show about criminal justice reform and about the role that DAs play in mass incarceration and all the many ills of our criminal justice system. But I would love for you to tell me, like, what is the role of the district attorney in the criminal justice system, and how does it contribute to all the problems that we have?
Well, I'm going to start with the second part of your question. It has contributed to the problems. The role is complex, right? It covers many areas. I think most people think that the district attorney is, this TV hero in front of the camera is trying a case, and putting, the bad guy, quote unquote, in jail. But the reality is that is very far from the truth. The reality is actually, especially in larger offices, the actual elected prosecutor is not going to be anywhere near a courtroom. The work is more, creating policies, determining how the office is going to proceed, what kind of cases we're going to file on, what kind of penalties we're going to seek, what type of laws are we going to support, what are we going to push legislatively, how do you work with the police, whether you hold the police accountable when they do wrong or you don't, how do you work in issues of social justice. So it's a very complex role, but at the core of it, the elected prosecutor in the American system is really the driver, the one that really determines, who's going to be incarcerated or who is not, or what are the resolutions. And I think people often don't realize just how powerful the role is because it has so much discretion. And that discretion can be used towards a good end or it can be used towards ends that are questionable. And I would argue personally that the mass incarceration in this country has been driven by and large by the behavior of prosecutors, wow, and especially elected prosecutors.
And so what kind of discretion are you talking about? What are the choices that prosecutors have made throughout, the last couple decades that have resulted in, everyone agrees, we have millions more people behind bars than we should have, that it's incredibly expensive, the cost in human life, the amount of suffering that happens, the economic impact, the humanitarian impact. It's one of America's greatest sins in my view. How has prosecutor discretion caused that to happen?
Well, prosecutors, the elected prosecutor, by the policies that they follow, they can determine, how cases are going to be resolved. They can determine, are we going to prosecute, simple possession of drugs? Are we going to be seeking sentencing enhancements that will send people to prison or jail for larger periods of time? Are we going to seek the death penalty? In a state like California, where you have, really dozens of different types of enhancements and 3 strikes, you can really multiply the period of time that somebody's going to go to prison just simply by the way that the policies that you put into place.
Yeah.
Also, legislatively, prosecutors have a strong voice in, when it comes to the development of new legislation. In most state capitals, elected prosecutors have an outside voice, often in Congress, right? So what you will see is if you look at LA as an example, before I was the elected DA, LA was sending somewhere, between, I would say, well, let's put it this way. In the last 8 years, we sent 22, 23 people to death row.
Wow.
Right? Most of them people of color, many with mental health problems. Or learning disabilities. I came in with a policy that we will not send any adults, we will not send anybody to death row. That is a huge impact, and it's purely based on the discretion of the elected DA. So
in the past, 22 people were being sent
23
to get
actually in the last 8 years. Yeah,
to get to the death penalty, and you're no longer doing that.
That's correct. So we stopped 2 years ago, and not only that, but we're removing people from death row and turning those sentences into life without the possibility of parole, which has a huge economic impact. Also, people on death row are much more costlier to the prison system than people that are
really
in the regular
because you would
prison.
think that after someone's dead they don't cost anything. So why would that be?
But just the housing, right? So the housing of somebody on death row is roughly about $500,000, as opposed to about $100,000 for the housing on the general population. When you add the fact that people on death row may be there for decades, pending appeals and the process, right? You're talking about millions of dollars on just a single individual. And then many of those folks are people that have been, determined to be, mentally disabled, learning disabilities. So they require other treatments and other cares. So it can really, the amounts start really adding up, and then they get old and they have all kinds of elderly ailments. So, it really multiplies many times. Or, for instance, let's take juveniles, right? Underage kids or kids under 18. The prosecutors have the capacity to decide whether one under 18 is going to be prosecuted as an adult or as a juvenile.
Right.
And the consequences are huge, right?
Yeah.
When you take a 16, 17-year-old, you send them to adult prison, you are almost always guaranteeing a life of criminality. They're going to go in there. The saying in prison is you're either prey or you're predator, right? So
you're taking a kid out of school and you're putting them into one of the roughest situations imaginable.
Exactly. You're going to put them in a place where they're going to be extremely vulnerable. And they're going to develop into a way that when they come out, they generally are going to have all kinds of issues, and they're less likely to be able to correct whatever behavior took them there into the first place.
Yeah.
Whereas if you put them into a juvenile system, thankfully the systems today are increasingly more therapeutic. They're really taking into consideration brain development and the stages of brain development for human beings. So the possibility of taking somebody that has maybe committed a really horrible act, but if you put them into a juvenile system, that they will be rehabilitated and they're going to come back into society and be somebody productive and actually not be committing other crimes and hurting other people is much greater than if we put them into adult prison.
So let me ask, if in the past, or many prosecutors currently, a 16-year-old will commit a crime and they'll try them as an adult and they'll send them to an adult prison. Why is that? Because to me, it seems like a pretty basic, fundamental thing. It's like, hey, if someone's 16 years old, they're a child. They should be treated. They're legally a child. They can't. They maybe can't drive a car, depending on how old they are, what state they're in. They can't be drafted into the army. They're required legally to be in school.
They can't vote.
They can't vote. Exactly.
Yeah,
They're a minor.
Right.
But there's one area of society we have a tendency. We've slid into this world where we are trying those people as adults. We're throwing them into prison for sometimes many decades, or even if it's even a couple of years,
right.
They can have devastating impacts on a kid. So why? What causes DAs to say, no, my policy is if a 15-year-old robs a liquor store or shoots somebody, that person is going to be tried as an adult?
Yeah, I think the origins of a lot of this had to do with a lack of understanding of how human brain development, right? So I remember when I first came on the job, it was the saying was, you commit an adult crime, you pay adult consequences. And we were not sophisticated enough to understand that, a 16-year-old may commit a very horrendous act, but they are working with a brain that is completely different than the brain of a 30 or 40 or 50-year-old.
Yeah.
And that taking that into account is different. And by the way, that you can take that young mind and with the right level of intervention, you can reprogram it fairly effectively, where it's very hard to reprogram a 30 or 40-year-old brain.
Yeah.
Right? So the dynamics are very different. Number one, they're operating in a different space mentally. And number two, unlike a fully developed brain, they actually are more susceptible to being reprogrammed, so they can they can behave differently. But we did not understand that. The problem is that we started down this path years ago when we had no understanding of this, but we're continuing to insist on this path now that we do. Yeah. And that's where the problem really comes.
Yeah. When I was 15 years old, I would steal shit. You know what I mean? Like kids when they're kids will do things that they would not consider doing as adults. Right. And we can look at that and say, well, children have certain predilections or certain things seem possible. They don't understand the consequences of their actions. Right. They don't understand, they don't quite have as many social bonds placed on them. Those are things that they learn through being taught properly. And by the way, I had a very fortunate upbringing. Yeah. A lot of people don't. A lot of people are, have disabilities, things like that. So to me, this stuff seems very natural. But we've really taken in criminal justice in this country like an incredibly harsh approach over the last 30 or 40 years, years, and that's expressed itself in the DAs, right? The DAs around the country have been following these incredibly harsh policies that have resulted in so many people being locked up who don't need to be or who shouldn't be because they did nothing wrong. In fact, they were innocent.
Yeah, no, and then that's the whole another component, right? People that are wrongfully convicted, right? People that are either convicted of something that they didn't quite do the way it was alleged, or they didn't commit the crime at all, right? So, one of the things that we're doing in my office, for instance, is, we're looking at, wrongful convictions. Just in the last year and a half, we have two cases, one of a gentleman that did almost 38 years in prison for a rape murder that he didn't commit. And in fact, he tried to get his DNA tested about 18 years ago, 20 years into his prison term, and the sitting DA refused, and at one point even said that the DNA had been destroyed, and we found out that it wasn't. And once we tested the DNA actually came back to the real killer / rapist. And interestingly enough, this guy had been a serial rapist, and he died in prison.
The actual culprit died in prison.
Yeah, but this other individual was in prison for 38 years. We had another case of a young man that at age 16 went to prison for murder, 20 years in prison. Again, factually innocent. His mother actually said multiple times, "Hey, my son was having dinner with me when the crime occurred," and everybody in the system figured out, well, the mother has a motive for not being truthful, to protect her child. There were things about the story that never square off.
Yeah.
And, 20 years later, we took a look and said, this guy was wrongfully convicted. But, we took 20 years away. We took somebody at age 16 and put him in prison for 20 years, and that there's no way to recover from that. So, the harm that prosecutors can do in the pursuit of this, this highly punitive approach to the work can have multiple facets, all the way from the extreme of wrongful conviction, as the ones that I said, to, cases where the discretion is being used in ways that is more harmful, like taking a 16-year-old, sending him to adult prison, or sending somebody to death row that may have mental disabilities, or frankly, as we realize, sometimes people are wrongfully convicted, right? If we haven't figured out a way to have somebody come back to life once you take a life away, right?
So, and that's the biggest argument against the death penalty is that the criminal justice system makes those mistakes quite often, and that in that case, when someone's dead, you've committed the ultimate crime of the state against them, that you've killed an innocent person.
Absolutely. Plus, it's also it's been determined to be very racially biased, right? Even in LA County, if you look at those last 23 people that I mentioned that went to death row in the 8 years prior to my coming into office, 22 of the 23 were people of color. They were men, right? Most of them were African American and Latino men. So when you look at the proportionality of and we're talking about people that are similarly situated. A white person committing a similar crime is less likely to face death row than a black person is, or a Latino. So these are all components to the system that cry for a different way of looking at the work.
Yeah, so I want to get into how you got into this, but I have to talk about this quickly. So you said that you've gone back and looked at these old cases that you realized were wrongfully concluded, that the person did not actually commit the crime, and you've released these people. You've given them their lives back. That's remarkable to me because I've had on this show Chris Fabricant, who do you know who he is? He's one of the head lawyers for the Innocence Project.
Okay.
He flies around the country, getting people off of death row or freeing them from prison using DNA evidence.
Right.
But this is a nonprofit. This is privately funded. People putting money into a 501c3. And I asked him, I was like, well, why doesn't the criminal justice system want to correct these mistakes? You would think that someone in your position, a DA, who finds out, hey, there's a chance that we wrongfully imprisoned this person, let's do a DNA test. You would think they would say, my God, I don't want to get it wrong. I don't want to falsely imprison people and send them to prison or to death row for crimes they didn't commit. So I would imagine if it were me, I would have a whole department devoted to making sure that we don't, wrongfully decide cases that that if new evidence comes to light, we get those people out. And yet almost no DA does that. I asked him why that is. He said the incentives aren't there. for that. That's not the incentive for DAs or for the criminal justice system. Why is it that you find yourself able to do that?
Well,
Why
I
is it
mean,
important?
and I want to make sure that we're very clear. By the way, this case is we have worked with the Innocence Project, right? It's a partnership, right? Because often you have this very experienced lawyers like Chris, right, that are being called by people that say, hey, I was wrongfully convicted, and they look into the case and they bring the cases to the prosecutor's attention. And the problem then becomes when they do bring the case to you, right? Like in the case that I mentioned earlier where we had this man that was in prison for 38 years, out of about 20 years of his prison term, as the DNA technology got better, right, he had people working on his behalf, lawyers working with the Innocence Project, say, hey, let's test this DNA. This man continues to say I was not guilty. And the prosecutor refused to do that. And that's where the incentives that we're talking about come in, is where, there's this culture sometimes in prosecutor's office that you're going to protect the conviction at any cost, right? You develop this ownership to the process. You feel like you did everything right, and you're not going to question this, right? And that goes to the issue of incentives. Also, I think the other part of it is it's often the case in traditional prosecuting offices that people are rewarded by the number of trials and by the most punitive that they can be in their approach to the work. I mean, in my office, for instance, it used to be that during training there would be competitions to see they would be given a hypothetical case, and there would be a competition to see who could extract the harshest sentencing approach. And because the sentencing schemes are very complicated, you can inject different types of enhancements depending on different set of circumstances. There may be a slight difference. So those that actually were able to strike the most were sort of like the top of that class, or they got the right.
If you got the biggest numbers, then you got the most promotions, or if you're a DA, you get reelected.
You get more recognition,
Yeah.
And then to the elected DA, it's DAs have been elected traditionally by being tough on crime. I'm going to lock people up. I'm going to lock people up, right? The conversations are shifting around the country, not only in LA, but we've seen other major, especially urban areas. But even we're seeing it in some suburban and rural areas where we're seeing, new DAs coming in that are coming in and saying, we are going to fight hard for the safety of our community. But that safety has to be done in a way that actually we reduce the likelihood of causing harm in our pursuit of that safety. And that actually, by the way, over-incarcerating doesn't make us safer. In fact, it increases insecurity in the community, right? One of the things that is often never discussed is our system has one of the highest recidivism rates of any industrialized modern legal system.
I didn't know that.
Right? We fail at somewhere between 50 and 70% of the time, right?
50 to 70% of...
Meaning that the people that we prosecute and convict, they're going to reoffend when they get released, right? And about 95% of the people that we send to jail and prison are coming out. So it's a statistical certainty that the people that you send in, they're going to come out, and the likelihood that they're going to reoffend, which means that there will be other victims, is very high. You take other systems like in Western Europe, and you see systems that have a 10%, 15% recidivism rate.
Wow.
Now, by the way, we know how to reduce recidivism, right? We got pilot programs that we have been doing for years where we work on rehabilitation inside the institution, and then we facilitate reentry into a measured way where people are given housing and employment training and drug treatment, and those people generally do not reoffend, right? So we know how to do it right, but we don't.
But if you don't do those things, if someone is in prison for 20 years and they get out of prison with, $20 and maybe a bus ticket or whatever in the cliche, then what are they going to do other than sell drugs or whatever it is they were doing?
They get out with a couple $100, right?
Yeah.
They have a criminal record, so most employers won't hire them.
Yeah.
Most landlords won't rent them. They don't have employment. They don't have housing, so they become, almost immediately, they become houseless.
Yeah.
They're hungry.
Yeah.
They got to eat, right? Just think about all the... And, by the way, they come out often with severe mental health problems, right? Because if you were not...
They were just in a cell for God knows how long.
Yeah, in a very violent and very stressful environment.
Yeah.
And often you self-medicate while you're there. So you come out, by the way, drugs are readily available in our prisons and jails at sometimes a higher rates than they are on the streets.
Wow.
So how do people deal with their pain? They self-medicate, right?
Yeah.
So they come out, they have mental health issues. They may be, they have substance dependence. They have no employment, no housing, no prospects of having employment or housing. They get dropped on the street and say, go figure it out, right?
Why would we think that this would work as a society?
Well, it's insane, right?
Yeah.
It's insane. And you tell people, we have done this before. We have seen the failures, right? And the old saying of, what's the definition of insanity?
Yeah.
Doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. Well, when it comes to our criminal legal system, we do that. I mean, I see it right now with fentanyl, right? Fentanyl is a horrible drug, right? It is causing death. It's causing tremendous, impact in our communities. By the way, across the board, it knows no demographics, no socioeconomic. We have affluent people, poor people, black, white people are being impacted by fentanyl. Some of them are taking it intentionally. Some of them are taking it not knowing that they're taking it. Yeah. And you already hear the talks about, let's actually create more penalties, right? We heard, Republican lawmakers wanted to classify it as fentanyl as a weapon of mass destruction, which will, and you start thinking and say, okay, we just came through a cycle of about 30 years of incarcerating people that were substance dependent.
Yeah.
And that failed, right?
Yeah.
And because, you're trying to bring a criminal justice solution to a public health problem. Now, there are people that need to be prosecuted aggressively, right? The people that are, sort of the mid-level, higher level people that are producing this stuff, absolutely. They need to be held accountable. But if the last 30 years taught us anything, is that, you cannot incarcerate your way out of a health problem. And drug dependence or substance dependence is primarily a health problem. And the criminal legal system has a role, but it's really a subservient role to public health. And we're already trying to see the tendency to those easy solutions instead of say, let's take a deep breath. Well, by the way, I'm very proud actually in LA County. We were able to put a work group together. We just had a press conference and we had public health. We had our school districts, we had nonprofits and community groups, and we had law enforcement and ourselves coming together and say, we recognize this is a horrible problem. It's causing death and destruction in our community. But we also recognize that the only way that we're going to be successful is by taking a holistic approach that is health care centered, and law enforcement will play the role that we have to play, but it's a peripheral role for us. And I am so proud of the fact that our county chiefs of police stepped up and in a very very intelligent way and say, we want to be part of the solution. We don't want to make the same mistakes of the past. Our public health, they have always been there, right? They've been telling us this stuff, so they're doing their job and our schools. So I'm very hopeful and very proud of the way LA County is responding to this problem. But you can see the tendency immediately comes up to how do we go back to locking people up? As if, if you got a drug addiction, being locked up is not going to solve the problem for you. And if you're selling, penny and nickel stuff on the street in order to pay for your addiction, number one, when you go to jail, you're going to go for a short period of time, if at all. Your addiction doesn't go away; it only gets worse, right? And you're going to be replaced by the next addict that will come in right after you. And we've seen this. It's like this is we've seen this picture before, right? Yeah. So it's not like it doesn't take a rocket scientist to say, okay, wait a minute, is this shit gonna work? No, it's not gonna work, right? Right, it won't. Right?
Yeah, if we just try the same shit again. But there's an incredible resistance to reform of any kind, and I want to get into that, but we have to take a really quick break. We'll be right back with more George Gascon. Hey everybody, I want to tell you about Kachava, the all-in-one daily super blend. If you're worried you aren't getting the nutrients you need, or if you're struggling to stay on top of your health, well, listen up, because Kachava says they have you covered. Kachava says they put everything your body needs in one glass, so you can have it all. All the vitamins, all the greens, all the protein, all the benefits for your gut, your hair, all the good stuff. No more compromise, no more guilt. They say that no other nutrition shake does all this. They travel to the ends of the earth to source it all and crush it up into a powder for you. Here's how it works. You just put a couple scoops into a glass, you add water, you blend it up. It tastes great. They've got 5 delicious flavors. I myself have tried chocolate, chai, matcha, all very delicious. I have it in the morning, keeps me full all the way through lunch. Really good stuff. And you know what? It can be difficult to get these kind of nutrients with your normal diet, trying to manage all those supplements and ingredients. Oh my gosh. But now, Kachava claims they make clean, organic, superfood nutrition accessible to everyone. So if you want to try it for yourself, they are offering 10% off for a limited time. Go to kachava.com/factually. That's KACHAVA and get 10% off your first order at kachava.com/factually. Okay, we're back with District Attorney of LA County, George Gascon. So I just want to talk quickly about how you became the District Attorney of Los Angeles. You were elected soon after the protests in the wake of George Floyd's murder in 2020. What caused you to run, and to what do you credit your victory? Because it was an upset victory. You unseated an incumbent who was the old-fashioned kind of DA, the law and order, lock them all up, never prosecute the cops kind of DA.
Yeah, and we did it by a large margin, over 250,000 people, and with a very clear agenda. By the way, there were no hidden, we put it all out there, and then day one, we went ahead and did the work. My journey was a little different than most. I started, I was a high school dropout, immigrant kid, grew up here in LA. Went to the Army. The Army kind of sort of fixed me if there was a fixing to be had. Then I became a police officer. Spent a career in the LAPD, going through the ranks to become number 2. And then I was the chief of police in Mesa, Arizona, and in San Francisco before I became the DA there.
What made you a reformer? Because, you said you were in the Army, you were a beat cop, you were a chief of police. This is not the job, the job resume of someone who is generally going to try to shake up the criminal justice system, I would think. Public defender, that kind of thing. So what made you become a reformer?
It was actually my own personal journey. Looking at my work, I work most of my time that I work in the streets, I work in East and South LA, Watts, and I began to see the evolution of one generation after the other of people that were being incarcerated, and the community was not necessarily getting any better. And people ask, well, do you have like one parting of the waters moment? And I said, there was not one, but there were multiples, right? The insurrection in 1992, right, which I used to call a riot, by the way, and now I call it an insurrection. People say, well, what are you talking about? I say, well, when I was a cop, it was a riot, right?
This is in the wake of Rodney King,
right? And then as I started to mature and to look at these things more deeply, I recognized that there was this level of anger and frustration within a community, and this particular incident, the Rodney King incident, and the outcome of the trial in Simi Valley was sort of a flashpoint, right, where people just, unleashed their anger, but it was a anger that was a result of years of exploitation and racism and all that stuff. So, were there some people that were rioting? Absolutely, but was that really the fair description of what happened there? And today I would say no. So, but that was one of those moments for me, and I remember, having, listening to Daryl Gates when he initially, after the Rodney King incident, saying, "Oh, this is."
That was the chief of police at the time.
He was the chief of police at the time, and saying, "Oh, this is an aberration." And we're on the streets at the time. I was working in South Central LA, Newton Division, which is kind of right on the border of Central and South. And we're looking at each other and say, well, that's not an operation, right? I mean, you run from us, those are the consequences, right? Yeah. So it was those periods of disconnect. It was looking, for instance, at the enforcement of drug laws, right? And understanding that we had undercover, very youthful-looking cops in schools in South LA making arrests when kids would have marijuana or were dealing in drugs or using drugs. But I knew that kids were using drugs in white neighborhoods at the same rate, sometimes even more.
Right.
But there were no legal consequences.
There's no undercover cops at Beverly Hills High.
Or frankly, most other, sort of middle class communities, right? So kids get to use drugs, they get to experiment, and, and then they grow up to be comedians and doctors and lawyers, right?
This is the conversation I have with people so often, with my neighbors about, the unhoused people, they're all using drugs, or, the criminals, it's all fentanyl. And I would say, hey, man, do you use drugs? And the person I'm talking to, I'm like, yeah, I do.
Yeah, no, well, exactly right. But the consequences,
we all use drugs.
But the consequences are generally different, right? Yeah. First of all, you don't get a criminal record, so you get to go to school or whatever you do. You start a business, or and you may actually stop using drugs, or you may continue to use drugs the rest of your life, as some people do. I mean, we have a lot of professionals that never stop using drugs, but they're never arrested. They never face those consequences. But the kids in these poor schools, they got arrested at age 15, 16, sometimes at 13, 14. They start building up a criminal record. And by the time they're an adult, they already have this long tail of arrest. Yeah. And, and the opportunities for them start to close and close and close. So, I saw that playing up in I was an actor in that play, right? I was right there in the middle of that theater that was playing those consequences. And as I became more educated on the subject, started, doing work with, like I said, the Kennedy School of Public Policy or the Council of State Governments, where I became a board member looking at justice reinvestment. And, I became more and more interested in learning what were the failures, what were the successes, and also how other places in the world were doing this. And, I remember when Portugal decriminalized drug use, 23, 24 years ago, and at first I thought, oh my God, they're crazy. Yeah. But you know what? I went to visit Portugal about 4 or 5 years ago, right? And guess what? Drug addiction in Portugal is significantly lower than it is in this country. Wow. Overdose deaths are almost non-existent. People don't go to prison for using drugs. People that are addicted are treated through the health system.
Their soccer team is better than ours. They're doing great.
Hopefully, I think ours will get better. By the way, we got a great squad. They're young kids.
Let's just change the topic of the podcast.
Yeah, don't get me on soccer. Okay, I love American soccer, and I think our teams are going to be butt kicking another 4 years.
2026, that's our year.
There will be. Okay, but I just saw Spain, losing a horrible game this morning. I was horrible. Just out of my phone.
I know, it almost made me late to this. I was watching
the anyway,
kicks.
Yeah. But, the point is that I think that, it was the exposure to both having real life experiences on the street, getting, more academic involvement, and looking at policy solutions and looking at what other countries were doing that just really took me to where I am today. So by the time that I became the district attorney in San Francisco, I was really very focused on showing that you can actually do public safety and that you can do so and be much more humane and that you need to be a lot smarter. And by the way, data and science supports all of this, right? We know, for instance, that lengthy incarceration periods do not make a community any safer. What they do is they increase recidivism. We know that drug addiction doesn't get cured by being incarcerated. We know that kids do not do better when they get put into the adult system, right? We know that, people that are houseless because of their social and economic conditions are not going to stop being houseless because you put them in jail for a couple of days or because you push them from one corner to the next, right? So this is all stuff that, it may seem really obvious when you think about it. But unfortunately, when it comes to policy development and our procedures, we sort of ignore that because we want the quick fixes, right? Yeah. I don't want to see the tent in front of my business. I don't want to see the half-naked lady walking around talking to a light pole, right? Yeah. It's disturbing.
But those things are not crimes that you just described.
They're not crimes, and they don't go away by simply just sweeping them out of the way, right?
So all the policy changes that you're talking about are very common sense. When you lay them out to people, they understand, you know, and so much of the country understands that, you know, mass incarceration is bad, that it's wasteful, all the things that we're talking about. But when you were elected by this large margin in Los Angeles County to do the thing that you said you were going to do, you ran on all of these things. And you ran again in the wake of George Floyd's murder and the protests. But you ran a very public campaign against these things, won by a large margin. You put them into practice. You made a lot of policy changes on your first day. And there was an enormous backlash, both in the press, in the public, and in the department itself. Yeah. And I'd love to talk about, to what do you credit that backlash? I mean, I've read plenty of op-eds, read plenty of people saying, oh, he did too much on the first day. He didn't run it by enough people, da-da-da-da-da. Like basically saying it was a political issue, could have been handled better. Yeah. I'm curious whether you feel that's the case, or is there some element of this backlash that is just so built into the system that it's going to happen no matter how nice you play? Even if you were to take 5 years to put all those reforms and go real slow, would you maybe have seen the same backlash? Do you have a view on that?
Yeah, and you know what? I'm going to, again, take this backwards. I'm going to start at the end. I think the system is baked the way it is, and the backlash would have been there no matter what. Mm-hmm. And I have to tell you, actually, up to the night before I was sworn in, I basically was playing with, I had kind of two acceptance speeches, right? One was the sort of the gradual, we're going to do this on a step-by-step basis. And the other one was, we're going to put it all out there, and then we're going to start working through it. And at the end, and I really struggle with this because I have run large organizations before, and I know that generally you want to gain consensus.
Yeah.
Right. And in the world, consensus is important, by the way. I try to govern, and certainly I work, in the political environment seeking consensus. But I recognize that the elections have been so intense, and that what I was trying to do was such a departure, and there were so many economic and social and political interests here that I felt that if I tried to go incrementally, I was going to die by 1,000 cuts, mm-hmm. right? And nothing was going to move. The needle was going to move either very slowly or not at all, because I was going to get sued at each step of the way. So I figured that I put it all out there, and then we'll work with it, and we'll refine it, and we'll continue a process of improvement, which I truly believe, by the way. I don't think, learning and improving is a journey. It's not a destination, right? As a human being, we're better when we're always seeking new knowledge and evolution. And I believe in that personally. In fact, I tell people I try to make mistakes every day, because if I'm making a mistake, assuming it's not a stupid mistake or intentional, but, just mistakes for trying, you're evolving, you're learning, and you're getting better at your trace. So I decided to go that route, understanding that I was going to face that backlash immediately. And I did. There was immediately a recall effort. I mean, the day that I was sworn in.
Two failed recall
Two fails. In fact, they say, they spent about $2 million the first time, and then they spent about $8 million in the second time.
And couldn't collect enough signatures to actually.
They couldn't, and they lied to people. By the way, they lied. I remember actually being stopped at a Costco.
You were stopped to sign?
Oh yeah. So this individual, it was really funny because. Young man, he comes out to me and says, "Hey, would you like to get rid of rapists in your neighborhood?" And that, and I said, "Well, who wouldn't?" And so I said, "So what do I need to do?" And he said, "Oh, you just got to sign here." So I grab it, and of course I'm playing along. I know what's going on, right? I can see. I said, "Oh, this is about recalling the DA." And I asked him, I said, "Do you know who the DA is?" And he said, "No, I don't." And I said, "Where are you from?" Because he sounded like he was a little off for the area. Yeah. I don't mean off in terms of his physical appearance, but just he didn't seem to know what he was doing. And he said, "Well, I'm from Florida."
Yeah.
And I said, "Well, what are you doing here?" So I do this for a living. We do this, I get paid really well. I make over $100,000 a year. And, we get paid to come here and all that stuff.
And get signatures from people to try to recall a district attorney.
So basically, his whole pitch was, get rapists out of your neighborhood, right? Yeah. Well, I think I don't think any of us want rapists in our neighborhood, right? I have two daughters, I have a wife, I got neighbors that I got a lot of women in my life that I'm very, that they're very important to me, right? So But they lie, and even with all that lying, they collect the signatures out of the county. I had a person come to me and say, I live right on the border between LA and San Bernardino County, and I told the guy, I live in San Bernardino County. He said, well, don't worry about it, just sign here.
Yeah.
I mean, it was, and we saw that. We saw about 40,000 signatures from other counties, right? So it was that insanity that really shows you that, there's this level of desperation because people feel like they're losing their currency, they're losing their political power. There's absolutely a financial incentive to this, right? These are industries, right?
So what is the financial incentive for someone is paying this man and many other people to go collect signatures to try to recall you as a district attorney. So someone, if they're spending money, they therefore must be either very ideologically committed or they are making money somehow from the current system. So what is the profit motive there?
Yeah, so you have, you have some people that are very ideologically committed, right? And there's some are very wealthy and they view this as a political issue, which shouldn't be, by the way. Healthcare, public safety, I know that we politicize these issues all the time, but they really should be apolitical. As a safety wire, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, whether you're right, left, whatever, we all want to live in a safe community. We don't want our family to be victimized. We definitely don't want to be victimized by a system, right? I think these are basic human needs and desires, but we have turned it into political issues. And then what you have is you have industries that revolve around here, right? So if you're in the prison system, you may be supplying medical assistance or food or care, whatever you're supplying, right? A
lot of people making money off the prison
system. You may be building prisons. We have towns in the state of California where the entire town's economy is dependent on a prison, right?
Yeah.
In fact, we just saw recently a particular town where, because we're reducing our incarceration rate, the prison is being shut down. And you have the town go up in arms because,
You can't shut down our prison. This is how little Bobby's dad puts food on the table, which is true.
Is true, right? And by the way, I'm sensitive to that. And one of the things I believe that we should be doing as we're shutting these prisons, we should actually be spending money in those communities to train people and provide people other work opportunities. I believe the same thing with fossil fuels. We can't just simply say we're going to shut down all the oil fields and leave all those families. No, we need to teach people, whether you're working in the coal industry or, there should be economic incentives for people to actually get out of those harmful industries and be able to continue to live a respectful life, an honorable life where they're earning money for their families. So I totally believe that just simply shutting down the prison is not.
But this is the way the system is entrenched because there are so many people, just talking about the state of California, really any state in the country, that are making a living off of criminal justice, off of the current horrible system.
And then you have political currency to this, right? Because you have, like, for instance, you have police unions or you have prison guards unions, right? They grow because the more members you have, the more money you take. The more money you take, the more powerful the union is because you can buy your way into, you can entertain legislators and you can pay D.A.s for their campaigns. You can do all kinds of stuff, right? So it becomes symbiotic, right? The more you have, the more you get. The more you have, the more you get, right? So all of a sudden, when you're going after the core of that entire ecosystem, you're taking away power, you're taking away money, and systems, and I tell people, look, this is no different than the tobacco industry, fossil fuels, right? You go to the core of an industry, people are going to fight back.
You also have had to really, I don't quite know the right phrase, but you've had folks in your own department go to war with you, where, the folks who work underneath you, who you were elected to lead, but, people who have been there their entire careers and have gotten used to working a certain way.
Yep.
You come in, you institute these reforms, and they are up in arms, and their union is up in arms. I say this as a member of two unions who believes in unions greatly, but must be very difficult for you as a reformist at the head of an organization where, you're up here, but all the people below haven't gotten on board yet. How do you handle that?
Yeah, and look, first of all, I'm a 100% union person, right? I was making, as a 16-year-old, being a union employee at a supermarket, I was making more money than my parents who were working in a factory for minimum wage. So I believe in the value of unions. I think this is not about labor, right? This is again, this is about structure. You got people that have been doing business in a certain way for decades, and somebody's coming in and saying, you know what, we need to try something different because what you have done has been harmful, and it's very hard for people to adopt to that. And then
because they want to believe, hey, when I try to increase my convictions every year, I'm doing a good deed. I'm not hurting people. How dare you?
100%.
Yeah,
I don't think
feel that way.
I don't think that people come into this job saying I'm going to do bad things, right? You come in because you want to help. The question is that the definition of help was created in a way that it shaped your way of looking at the world, and that definition now is being questioned. And I think that people have a hard time with that. And by the way, it's not all the people in the office. They're key people, right? And some of them are also, just simply because of politics, right? I mean, we live, unfortunately, in a very polarized world today, right? Where politics and the emotion behind politics shut down truth and facts and reason, even with very smart people. We see extremely smart people that believe that Joe Biden wasn't elected president, right, rightfully, right? And you have to question yourself, well, how can that happen with a very smart person? And, you have to dig a little deeper and say, well, where do they consume information from? And then pretty soon you see that the places that they get information from is telling them that this election was stolen, right? And it's repeated over and over. And so we are products of our own environment in many ways, right? And within our larger community, we have ecosystems that we become products of our own, subset of that community.
I think it's very interesting because to hear you talk about those folks, you're talking about them with the same empathy that you have for, a juvenile offender who's committed a crime at the age of 16 because of the environment that they were raised in. You're saying, oh, well, for these folks, hey, if you're watching Fox News every day, this is what you're going to believe about the world.
I do. Listen, I tell people, and I say this without any hesitation. I grew up in a Republican household.
Yeah.
Right? My parents were very conservative. It was a different kind of Republican Party, by the way, but it's not necessarily, I look back, I don't even agree with what they believed back then, but it was certainly different. I mean, my father believed in the Constitution. They believed that, you lost an election, you got to figure out how to win it the next time around, right? So it was a very different approach, but nevertheless, socially and economically, I look back at, and I disagree with the whole process. But I tell people that, politics are like religion, right? I was born in a Catholic household, right? I mean, that's what you become, right? You're not thinking about you and being Jewish if you're Catholic, right? It's just or vice versa. Politics are the same way. But so I have a great deal of empathy because I believe that most people want to do the right things. Most people want to be good to their community. They want to live in a place that they can flourish and others can flourish around them. And I think that you pick up extremists, obviously, that have, other views, but I don't think that's the core of the disagreement in this country today. I don't think that there are 70 million Americans that somehow are all racist and, driven by, or they believe everything that Donald Trump says or that, I think that there are legitimate places for disagreement there, and I think that we are a product of that environment, whatever we are. And by the way, I tell the same thing to my friends on the left. If you watch MSNBC every day, you're going to start thinking of the world also in a certain way. So it's good to kind of try to straddle and look back and forth. But I think that the problem is, and I've tell that to some relatives of mine that are very conservative, I said, because well, what can you come more to the center? I said, the problem is you guys are going so far to the right that the center keeps shifting to a place that is unacceptable for some.
Criminal justice issues, sometimes they really do seem to transcend party politics. That, you have Democrats who are really, really hard on, crime and punishment, law and order, folks like that. You've got Republicans who have a more libertarian slant and they know that we're wasting too much money on prisons and that, this is a bad approach. So it does cut across some of those divisions sometimes. And sometimes to me it feels that the desire for punishment, and punishment specifically of people who are not like you, is something that lurks within the human heart to an extent. And it comes out in weird ways. I'm often struck by the dichotomy that we see in the press and in the culture around this issue. You'll see, if I open the LA Times, or the New York Times, I'll see an editorial that says, mass incarceration is horrible, we're wasting so much money, we're hurting so many people, it's clearly unjust, we must end it. And then you'll see it right next to an article saying, is George Gascon going too far? Are these reforms, like people are up in arms and are people going to recall him? Or you'll see that about Larry Krasner in Philadelphia or in San Francisco or around the country, you know, right next to each other. Like, the things that they were writing about Larry Krasner before he was reelected in Philadelphia made it look like he was doomed, and then he won by a huge margin, you know? And this is because folks like him, folks like you, have put into place the exact policies that the editorial page is calling for. The exact policies everybody agrees we need to do. Need to stop trying kids as adults. Need to stop, you know, throwing people in prison for 20 years for having, you know, an eighth of weed in their pocket or whatever. You know, we know that the war on drugs failed. Everyone agrees on this intellectually, but then once it actually happens, there's this groundswell of pushback that comes from seemingly all quarters, even from the places that like intellectually know it, you know? And I'm curious why you feel that is. Is it something that is just sort of lurking within our culture that comes out as soon as there's any pushback against it?
Yeah, look, I think there are many components, right? Number one, I think that there is no question that there is a racial bias in the implicit, and I'm going to exclude the clearly racist, you know, sort of tendencies in some of the extremes. But I think that there.
I don't know if we need to exclude it because it's a real thing.
Well, it's a real thing.
People are racist.
No,
you know?
It's a real thing. But even in the subconscious area, right? There is a whole thing about, you know, people that do not look like me, right? I look at them with less forgiveness and less tolerance for you know, sort of missteps, if you will. So that's one component. The other component is, I think, to the point that you raised, editorial pages in the news, right? The editorial pages are appealing to our intellectual higher being, if you will. They get the time to think about, you know, these issues. They talk to people, and they come out with very thoughtful, you know, conversations around these issues. And they do it for healthcare, criminal justice, housing. But then you get into the daily grind of the news, right? And the urge to be able to capture readership or to capture ratings. You know, my wife was a TV anchor, a news anchor, right? And the desire to be salacious in order to capture, you know, more eyes on the screen. And now you add to that the complexity of today's social media, which is a free-for-all, it's like the Wild West, right? I mean, journalists years ago, you were taught in journalism school that, you know, you need to check multiple sources to confirm a story, and you know, and there was a sort of concept of balanced presenting. That's all gone out the door because you got a guy now with an iPhone that can, you know, start a blog and say, you know, the world is crumbling, and show you a couple of pictures from whatever, and next thing you know, the world is crumbling, right? So I think you have all these forces that are playing a role where, yeah, you have, you know, really smart, thoughtful conversations going on here. But this is not what drives the daily stuff, right? The daily stuff is a local news channel showing a Ring camera showing some guy robbing somebody or breaking into a store. And by the way, they repeat it over and over and over again.
Yeah, one anecdote repeated over and over.
And they do it, you know, very intentionally, right? Because they understand how the dynamics of the stuff work. I mean, I see it in my own case where they'll cover story with complete falsehoods. You know, like they have one that said, you know, I let go of this juvenile that got involved in an accident, and he ran over this baby, and you could see the tire marks on the baby's head. Well, let's think about it for a moment logically. If you can see the marks of a tire over a baby's head, the baby is dead.
Yeah. Baby,
by the way, was completely uninjured, right? And not to take any responsibility away from the young man that did the crime. But then what you see is they had, because it was a video of this when the car hits and the mother is sort of flying, and horrendous video. And they got this thing in repeat, and they're having the story, and they got a guy talking about tire marks, and they're showing this over and over and over. And then they would show a picture of me, and the most unkind picture of me that you can find, right? I mean, and you can see this thing sort of playing over and over and over in the background. If you happen to be a consumer of information from that particular news channel, You see that play out for about 3 or 4 minutes, multiple times in the day.
And this, by the way, this isn't Fox News. This is just the local news. This is just right.
Yeah,
I mean, it's not. It's not the Fox News channel on cable.
No. This is local news, right?
That everybody watches every night. Yeah.
And you come out of there and you're all fired up, and you say, "Well, this guy, and then you get somebody that has some mental health issues that all of a sudden decides that he's going to cure the world." And this is a guy who goes to a pizza parlor in Washington, D.C. looking for pedophiles and wants to kill people, right? Which I think is the consummate irresponsibility of many people in the traditional media today. And then, of course, the people that could care less that are in social media, right?
But so we get these cases that you say, like 1 or 2 salacious cases that are repeated over and over again. One thing that I find is that the stories of the harms that are not done because of the policies that you're putting in place, the people who are not being falsely convicted, the people who are who you find that were wrongfully convicted, who you're able to release, those stories are not told to nearly the same extent, and that is. It's strange because that is literally why you were elected, right? Because you pledged to do these things. So when it comes to one of the things that's really consumed me is how we fight back against the backlash to criminal justice reform, because it's clearly national, right? It happens everywhere that a reformer comes in, and the track record of being able to beat the backlash is mixed so far. There's been some victories and there's been some losses. So if so many of us agree that we need to end mass incarceration in America, reform our criminal legal system, and the only way we can do it is by having reformers in positions of power and fighting the backlash. And so how do we do that? Do you have an approach?
Well, I do. I mean, I think that one of the things that I came to realize is that, the people that want to provide misinformation have very simple messaging, right? But it's sticky, right? And sometimes we try to get very complicated in the way that we approach our work. And I've sort of, and this has been kind of a team approach to this, but we've sort of come up to the conclusion, and it's actually 3 pillars that are very, very solid. Is, the way that we have to do this work is, number one, we have to educate. And that means whether we're talking about fentanyl and how to avoid fentanyl use and understanding the consequences, or we're talking about, violence in the streets, we have to educate our community. Number 2, we have to prevent. We have to be thoughtful in the way that we intervene in these issues and come up and use database, science-based information in order to be as effective as we can in our interventions. And then finally, we have enforcement, right? We have like the guy that is selling fentanyl by the large quantities. That individual needs to face harsh consequences from the criminal legal system, or the person that commits murder needs to certainly be held accountable for that, or the person that runs over a pedestrian needs to be held accountable for that. So that enforcement component has to be there. So we're basically trying to increasingly put everything in the framework of education, prevention, and enforcement, and every one of those pillars has a role. And one is not more important than the other because they all are necessary in order to do our work. The problem is that on the other side, you got people that are just talking enforcement, punishment. So you have to kind of sort of retract some of that.
And it's true as in law enforcement as in public health that prevention is hard to get people excited about. If you tell someone, I prevented something bad from happening that you never heard about, it sounds like a hypothetical rather than something that you actually protected
It's hard
them from.
well, look, I mean, your best cardiologists, right, are the ones that are talking to you about, diet and exercising and all the things that you need to do before you develop a heart problem, right? Yeah. But when do we normally go to a cardiologist? Right, we go there
after the problem,
After the problem, right? So it's how do we start injecting that, I believe that, the medical profession has gone through a revolution in the last 20 years.
Yeah.
Really focusing on prevention and quality of life approach to health, right? Because it's a recognition that by the time that you have to come up and do surgery, right now you're looking at the most harmful interventions that you have, right? So it's how do you whether it's prenatal care or whether it's after birth care, right? And so
How do we do that in law enforcement?
we need to do that in our public safety as well.
But something that I feel like we've really lost from this conversation, that you said that the tough on crime people have a simple message. They have simple clips they can repeat over and over again. That makes me realize that, in the wake of George Floyd's murder, we had that simple message, right? Yes. We had people around the country saying, in every state, saying, the criminal legal system, the policing system is hurting and killing people like me. That people saw themselves in George Floyd. They said, that happened to me, or that happened to someone that I know, or someone that I know is in prison who shouldn't be. And this is causing actual harm to us, right? And the entire country sort of snapped to attention and saw that for maybe about 6 months. Everyone was talking about, hold on a second. We have a system in place that is killing and hurting our fellow citizens and people who are not citizens and happen to just live here. And that is something that we want to stop. Oh no, right? I knew these things, but I had extra attention to them myself.
Right.
Oh my God, this is one of the worst things that we do as a country. We are hurting and killing our fellow citizens. And then it seemed that culturally all that just ebbed away and we forgot to have that awareness, and now when you turn on the news, it's no longer that kind of story. It's, the kind of salacious, nice white lady attacked by horrible criminal story that we used to get back in the 80s.
Right.
And that has been such a stunning reversal to me, and it has really seemed to interfere with our ability to address these problems, right? It's still the case that people are being hurt and killed by policing and by the criminal legal system around the country. So how do we bring more attention to that reality? I mean, maybe I'm the guy in the media, so maybe you should be asking me. But this is to me is the issue.
Well, listen, I think that we need to continue to be out there. I think that we need to engage. I think that we need to talk about these issues, right, in multiple mediums and approach it from different ways. I think that we have to have different messengers. The effective of a messenger in one community may be different in another. But you're absolutely right. There was a simplicity, although it's obviously a horrendous act, but it was simplicity to what occurred, to George Floyd, right?
Yeah.
The whole concept of I can't breathe, right? We just started seeing T-shirts, and that happened. Obviously, there were other similar killings, right? It embodied a whole world of messaging, right? Everybody could, sort of visualize what this meant, right? And we need to continue to look for these things, to engage and have these conversations. I think that what occurs, we've gone through 2 years of, more than 2 years now, an unprecedented pandemic.
Yeah.
There was isolation for, almost 2 years.
Yeah. That pandemic, exacerbated almost every social problem in the country, homelessness.
I think it did all of that.
Yeah.
I think it created a huge gap. And, I shouldn't say it created a gap. I think it showed the gap of our mental health system and how problematic it is. And I think that we're paying the consequence of that. And all certain, we have some increases in crime and violence. And we immediately had the fear mongers come in and they grab on the same old message. By the way, some of the stuff you look at the 1980s, 1970s, where there was a war on drugs, all this stuff, right? So it's the same recycled message. But when people are fearful, right, and they're being bombarded with information over and over again, right? I had a lady from Beverly Hills that reached out about a year and a half ago, and she was very upset because crime was just completely out of control in Beverly Hills, and she was talking about a particular crime, and I wanted to get to the bottom of this, and we're going back and forth in emails because she's using all caps in her emails initially. You know what that means, right? And so I'm trying to get to the case so I can go back and try to figure out the status of the case, and then she gets offended, and she says, well, all you got to do is look at Instagram and what's up, and you can see the crime problems in my city. And I said, okay. So then, actually, it was Tiffany Blacknell who became the person that went to talk to this lady. And after she spent a lot of time, first of all, clearly crime is not out of control in Beverly Hills. It hasn't been. It's one of the most safe communities. It has some things that happen that are really bad. But
it's had some bad individual incidents. But overall,
absolutely,
right?
overall. And by the end of the conversation, this lady basically tells Tiffany that I probably need better PR Right.
That you need better PR.
I do, yeah, because and I think she was being earnest, and I understand that. But what the bottom line to this is, this lady was being bombarded with images through Instagram and other things that are, the Ring cameras and all this stuff that are being played over and over again, and we start developing a sort of a warp sense of reality, right? Our reality becomes, sort of engulfed in that information overload of a very negative stuff.
And we're not getting the side anymore of the harms that are prevented, right? Like why can't you go out there and say, hey, because of these reforms, this is how many years people did not spend in prison. This is how many lives were not wasted in prison.
And this is how many other victims you prevented from recidivism, and this is how many dollars and by the way,
how many millions and millions of dollars billions are spent
that
on
can go into other places, and because again, I got to go back to recidivism. Those people that we over criminalize, they go back and they harm other people. They harm themselves, but they keep harming others, right? If you take that out of the equation, you're actually creating more safety. And the real interesting thing is that when you sort of extract that sort of the pandemic period, you start looking at crime over like the last 10 years or so. Our crime rates have been very stable overall. There have been some, it's been a hike in some, homicides in some parts of the country. By the way, not connected to politics. We have seen very conservative jurisdictions actually per capita have higher hikes of homicides, but people are not accusing those DAs. I tell people all the time, I haven't heard anyone accuse a Kern County DA of causing an increase in homicides in Kern County. By the way, homicides in Kern County per capita are much higher than they are in LA County.
Yeah, that's the strange thing, that crime has gone up a certain amount nationally. Nowhere near where it was in the 80s.
Right.
It's gone up some places 5%,
or even
10%.
the early 2000s.
Yeah, it's still if you look at the long-term trend, it's still extremely down. It's also been a national trend up, and it's only in places where a little bit of reform has happened that people are saying, oh, well, that's because of the reformers. Right. But they don't say that about the places where crime has gone up. They don't say that about, Georgia or Miami or places like that.
No, they don't.
They only say it about places where reformers have been elected.
That's right. Yeah.
And again, no focus is put on what has been done and the money that has been saved, the lives that have been saved. But the thing that really concerns me the most is how much over the last few years the voices of those most impacted by the criminal legal system and by over-policing have been lost in the political conversation. The thing about the post-George Floyd moment was that, here in LA, the black population is not the majority population in the city or the county. But there was a moment. But those are the folks who are extremely impacted by and large. And you heard those voices elevated during 2020, the year that you came to power.
Yeah.
In the years since, the voices that we've been hearing the most are the lady from Beverly Hills who has seen too much, horrible stuff on the news or on Instagram. And, you literally heard one of our candidates for mayor saying, crime's out of control. People are leaving their pearls at home when they go out to dinner. That's how bad things have gotten. I'm like, is that really bad? That to me doesn't sound that bad, first of all. But second of all, that's whose voice is being prioritized in the election. No one is talking anymore about the George Floyds of Los Angeles or the George Floyds of anyone else in the country who are being, injured or killed every day because they are still the minority voices and the people who do not have control over the media ecosystem, even though those are the people who we need to be concerned about when we're talking about reform. So how do we elevate those voices politically, and remind everybody that that's who we're fucking talking about here, Yeah,
well, as you well know, right now, you're talking about race, you're talking about economics, right? You're talking about communities that are extremely vulnerable and they're generally voiceless.
Yeah.
And they don't have always the best representation. I like to kind of talk about the glass being half full, though, because the elections in LA County, and actually nationally, but especially in LA County, these elections were completely contrary to what the narrative was.
That's
the narrative
true. You're talking about this year, 2022.
This year, the media was playing this up, that this is, oh my God, it's going to be a huge backlash.
Yeah.
We got the first African-American woman elected mayor of LA and a progressive.
Someone who worked in those communities.
Yeah, absolutely.
On that kind of reform.
We have multiple young progressives being elected to city councils against incumbents. We had a very, a nightmare of a sheriff that got voted out of office by a large margin.
Yep.
So I see...
And reformist DAs are being elected nationally in other cities and counties around the... I don't want to make this all about L.A., but literally other places it's happening too now.
I can tell you this, okay? When I first became elected in 2011 in San Francisco, I remember having a meeting with some friends. I would say, where are the progressive district attorneys around the country? We couldn't find one in the big city. I mean, there were some people that were doing some interesting stuff in some places, but there was not like a... I belong to an organization now that we have about 60 people there. Mostly are women of color, by the way, and it's growing every year. Every time that we get together for
progressive DAs?
Progressive DAs around the country, right? So, and if you look at most of your large counties, okay, so, New York, you have your boroughs, right? You have out of the boroughs there, you have, the Brooklyn, you have Manhattan, you have I forget
Staten Island, Queens.
Yeah, right. But you have Manhattan and Brooklyn, with very progressive DAs.
Yeah.
You have Cook County, which is all the Chicago area. You have Philadelphia. You have L.A. You have just recently Alameda County, which is one of the largest counties here in California. You have Contra Costa County. So we're seeing this in Texas. We've seen it in Dallas. We see it in Austin. So even in those places, right, because to the point that you made earlier that actually I wanted to grab on for a second, there is a segment within the Republican Party to the more libertarian, the more true to the Republican values that recognizes that, over-incarceration is wasteful, right? Yeah. It's economically wasteful, it's socially wasteful. Years ago, I went to Austin. I was invited to go speak to a group by a group called Right on Crime. And, it was all very, very conservative Republicans, and I was blown away by their approach to crime. And actually, people often don't realize, like Prop 47 here, for instance, was supported by very conservative, libertarian Republicans. We got funding for Prop 47 by Republicans as well as we did by Democrats. Prop 47 was a reform of drug policy in the state that basically said if you're in possession of drugs for personal use, it's a misdemeanor, no matter what the drugs are. And if you commit a low-level theft, and we, define low-level theft as anything under $950, theft, by the way, not robbery, not burglaries, that would be considered a misdemeanor. And some of the biggest donors to this were very conservative, kind of the right on crime folks. Yeah. So, sometimes it doesn't really matter what on-ramp you get onto the freeway, right? If we're all marching in the same way, whether you're doing it for economic reasons, you're doing it for social or for both, I think that when we get to the editorial pages thinking, whether you're on the right or the left, we come up to the same conclusion, that we have to reduce incarceration and that safety needs to be achieved in different ways.
Well, I'd love to end this by just talking about, what are you proudest of that you have accomplished? How have your reforms been improving things in your view, and what are you most excited about for the future?
Look, I'm very proud of the fact that while it's been really bumpy, we just had a press conference a few days ago, and we had L.A. County Chiefs of Police, we had the head of the Public Health Department, we had school district superintendents. We had community groups, including Drug Policy Alliance, and we had the prosecutor, and we're all standing together to talk about how we're going to deal with fentanyl. Yeah. That would never have happened before. To me, is the glass is more than half full. We're seeing, progressive chiefs of police. We're seeing people coming around to understanding, yes, some people will be incarcerated. Yes, some people need to be, prosecuted. But guess what? That cannot be the only solution. And that press conference to me was the most inspiring moment that I've had in the last 2 years. I'm so glad to hear that. And it's been a real pleasure having you. And thank you so much for sharing your thoughts so candidly. I really do appreciate it, George. Thanks so much for being here. Thank you. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you once again to George Gascon for coming on the show. I hope you enjoyed and got as much out of that interview as I did, and I want to thank you for listening. I also want to thank our producer, Sam Roudman, our engineer, Kyle McGraw, and everybody who supports this show on Patreon, particularly those of you who support the show at the $15 a month level. That's folks like Larry Latouf, Chris McKinless, Thomas Lewis, Benjamin Cornelius Bates, Harmonic, and Duck Moo. Thank all of you so much, and everybody else who I did not have time to list because I do not have all of you on my phone, but next time I'll read a lot more names. And of course, if you want to join them, head to patreon.com/Adam Conover, and I'll thank you for doing so. And of course, thank you to Andrew WK and Falcon Northwest for building me the incredible custom gaming PC that I'm recording so many episodes of this show for you on. If you want to find me online, you can do so at Adam Conover, wherever you get your social media. I'm even on Mastodon now at Adam Conover at mastodon.social. Mastodon addresses are a little hard to read over the air, but I think you Mastodon people will get it. You can also find me at adamconover.net. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next week on Factually.
Starburns Audio, a podcast network.